What's going on, guys? So today we're going to be looking at LeetCode problem 2839, check if strings can be made equal with operations, part 1. So in this problem, you're going to be given two strings, and they both have a length of 4 and consist of lowercase letters. And we want to see if using a specific operation, is there a way that we can make these two strings equal to each other? So what we're allowed to do for either string is we can pick two indices, I and j, such that the difference between j and I is 2, or in other words, these two indices are two spaces apart, then we can swap the two characters at those indices in the string. And we can perform a swap any number of times, as long as that swap occurs between two indices that are two spaces apart. And if after performing a swap, we can make these two strings equal to each other, then we can return true. Otherwise, we have to return false. So if we're given two strings, ABCD and CDAB, we can see that these two strings aren't equal to each other, but we can try performing swaps to either string to get them to equal to each other. So if we were to put the characters of each string into a zero-indexed array, what are all the possible swaps we can make? Well, again, the problem wants us to find two indices, I and j, where j minus I equals 2. And we know that every string we're going to be given has a length of 4. So there's really only two pairs of indices that we can perform swaps on. We can set j to 2 and I to 0, because 2 minus 0 will give us 2. And we can also set j to 3 and I to 1, because 3 minus 1 also equals 2. And so if we swapped the characters at index 2 and 0 with each other for the first string, we'd end up with C at the first index and A at the second index. And we can see that now these two indices match the indices in the second string, but they're still not equal because the characters at index 1 and index 3 for either string don't match each other. But because we can perform the swap any number of times, we can also swap these two indices so that D moves to the first index and B moves to the third index. And now we can see that the first string and the second string are equal to each other. So in this case, we could return true. So what's a way that we can write a formula to get us to determine if two strings can be made equal to each other by performing any number of swaps? Well, you might think at first to go through each index in each string, comparing the two characters at each index. And if they don't match each other, then you could determine if there's a character that's two indices apart that you could swap to get them to match. But another way that we could determine if the strings can be made equal is to split the characters in each string into two groups. Because remember that there's only two sets of pairs that we can swap between. So for the first string, we'd end up with these two groups where we could swap either of the characters between each other. So in group 1, we have A and C, and in group 2, we have B and D. And notice that because we're spacing potential swaps apart by 2, all the indices in group 1 are even, and all the indices in group 2 are odd. So we can actually call the two groups for this string S1 even and S1 odd. Likewise, for the second string, we also have two groups, one for even indices and one for odd indices. And so now all we have to do is compare the two even groups and the two odd groups. Because if two strings can be made equal to each other, then both of them must have the same two characters for positions 0 and 2, and the same two characters for positions 1 and 3. And the order that we find them in for each group doesn't matter because we can just swap the two characters. So what we're trying to determine is for both strings, are the values in each of their even groups equal to each other? And are the values in each of their odd groups equal to each other? So for the first string, are the characters at index 0 and index 2 the same as the characters in the second string, S2, at index 0 and index 2. And we also want to determine if the characters at S1 for the odd indices, which are 1 and 3, are equal to the characters at those same indices for S2. And after substituting the characters at the array indices, we can see that the same two characters, A and C, appear in both even groups, and the same two characters, B and D, appear in both odd groups. And so because of that, we can return true. If we were to look at another example where S1 is A, B, C, D, and S2 is DCAB, we can put the characters in each string in a zero-indexed array and group the characters depending on whether they appear in an even index or an odd index. And here we can clearly see that both the even groups and the odd groups do not have the same characters in them, which means that there's no way that we can swap the characters in either string to get them to equal to each other, and therefore we can return false here. So now that we have an idea of how to solve this problem, let's move on to a solution in LeetCode. So here we are in LeetCode, and I'm going to be using Python to write up a solution. And just like in the examples, we're going to have even and odd groups for S1 and S2. And we can use a set as a data structure for each group because sets are unordered. So it won't matter what index we find the characters in each string, as long as they appear in both sets. So we can start by creating a set for S1 even, which has the characters for S1 at the indices 0 and 2. And we can do the same for S2 even, which will be a set containing the characters for S2 at indices 0 and 2. Then we can also create sets for the odd groups. So for S1 odd, we'll have the characters for S1 at the indices 1 and 3. And for S2 odd, we'll have the characters for S2 also at the indices 1 and 3. Then all we have to do is determine whether the even sets are equal to each other and the odd sets are equal to each other. And again, because we're using sets, we know that the order in which they appear in each set doesn't matter, and as long as the values in both even sets and both odd sets are equal, the two strings can be made equal and we can return true. So we can simply return the result of whether S1 even equals S2 even and S1 odd equals S2 odd. So if we run this code, we can see that both test cases pass, and if we submit the problem, we can see that it's accepted. So there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like. If you have any questions, you can leave a comment down below. And be sure to subscribe so you can see when my next video comes out. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.